ሐሳብ ገበታ ሐሳብ ያለ ልዩነት ሚዛናዊነት እንዲሁም በአሳታፊነት የሚንሸራሸርበት ቤት። በሐሳብ ገበታችን ወቅታዊ፣ ማህበራዊ፣ ፖለቲካዊ እንዲሁም የህግ ጉዳዮች በስፋት በጥልቀትና በአካታችነት ይቀርባሉ። የሳምንቱ እንግዳም የሳምንቱ በተጋባዥ ማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች፣ ፖለቲከኞች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች የሚቀርቡበት ፕሮግራም ወቅታዊ ጉዳይ ወቅታዊ ሀገራዊ ጉዳዮች የሚዳሰሱበት ዝግጅት፣ የውይይትና የክርክር መድረክ በተለያየ ጎራ የሚገኙ ታላላቅ ፖለቲከኞች፣ የማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች በሐሳብ ዙሪያ ፊት ለፊት የሚወያዩበት ከዛም አልፎ የሚሟገቱበት ፕሮግራም ህዝባዊ መድረክ በተለያዩ ጉዳዮች ላይ ሁሉም የሐሳብ ገበታ ቤተሰቦች በቀጥታ ሐሳባቸውን የሚያቀርቡበትና ተሳታፊ የሚሆኑበት ለቤተሰቦቻችን እድል የምንሰጥበት ጊዜም። እነዚህና ሌሎች ሳምንታዊ ፕሮግራሞችን ለእናንተ እናቀርባለን። ይህንን የተወደደ ቻናል ሰብስክራይብ በማድረግ ቤተሰብ ይሁኑ፣ በስፋት ተደራሽ እንዲሁም ለሌሎች ያጋሩም። የሐሳብ ገበታው እንዲጠናከር በተሻለ ጥራትና ስፋት ወደ እናንተ እንዲደርስ በሐሳቦ በሙያውና በገንዘቡ ይደግፉን። የሐሳብ ገበታን በሱፐር ቻት፣ በሱፐር ታንክስና በሱፐር ስቲከር አጋርነቱን ያሳዩን። በጎፈንድሚ አማራጭ የሐሳብ ገበታን ያበረታቱ። ስለ ሐሳብ አስተያየቶ እንዲሁም ድጋፎም እናመሰግናለን። ዓላማችን የሐሳብ ማህበረሰብ መፍጠር ነው። የሐሳብ ገበታም
Hello all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is our special program in commemoration of the second anniversary of the Pretoria Agreement on the permanent cessation of hostilities. As you all recall, 2 years ago on this day, the Pretoria Agreement has brought the Tigray war to an end, but we couldn't see any peace inside over the last 2 years. Conflicts are raging throughout other parts of Ethiopia, particularly in the Amhara and Oromia regions. Today we have a very distinguished panelist here. So we have an esteemed panel with us, each of them bringing a wealth of knowledge and experience to our conversation. Therefore, allow me to introduce our distinguished speakers briefly. The first one is Professor Ezekiel Gabisa. As you all know, he's a renowned academic and expert in his field, whose extensive research and contribution has significantly impacted our understanding of Ethiopian history, sociology, and other related issues. More specifically, Professor Ezekiel is a public intellectual and a regular analyst on media, including the Buffet of Ideas. I am deeply honored to have him with us. Welcome, Professor Ezekiel. Mr. Yared Haidermarem is a respected human rights advocate whose influence is felt in the fight for justice and accountability. With his years of experience for almost 20 years, Mr. Yared has dedicated himself to supporting marginalized communities and ensuring that the voices of those marginalized communities are heard both nationally and internationally. His commitment to this cause is unwavering. With that, I welcome Mr. Yared as well. Welcome, Mr. Yared. Third one is Mr. Faisal Roble. He is also a distinguished urban planner and policy expert with an extensive background in governance and development. He just retired from his urban planning job, but still actively involved with us on media, including today. His insights into peace and conflict resolution, equity and justice for marginalized communities, and the politics of the Horn of Africa are widely recognized. So I welcome Mr. Faisal Roble. Welcome. The fourth one is Mr. Hone Mandefro. He brings a wealth of expertise in human rights advocacy, particularly his role in bringing the Amhara people's plight to the fore is notable. He is a staunch human rights defender. Mr. Hone, welcome to the Buffet of Ideas. Last but not least, we have Mr. Getachew Tamara. He is a student of peace and conflict studies, and he is also a human rights advocate. He is a strong media savvy. Welcome, Mr. Getachew. So with this brief introduction for those of you who are not well acquainted with our speakers, even though they have been appearing regularly on the buffet of ideas. I just failed to introduce them today. So with that, our today's discussion will be how we understand the Pretoria Agreement, what it means, what it doesn't mean. In 2 years, what has been implemented or not implemented, outstanding issues, and most particularly, whether the Pretoria Agreement has brought peace in Ethiopia, and how we might learn from the Pretoria Agreement. So with that, I would like to welcome our speakers as well as our audience. I don't know how to start, maybe in terms of seniority. Let me start with Professor Ezekiel. So I took the liberty to start with him.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mogus, and happy to be with this distinguished panel to talk about the Pretoria Agreement and the progress that has been made over the last 2 years. I guess to measure and understand what was implemented and what is not, it's important to highlight the agreement itself. I think people or lawyers are better positioned to interpret what the articles mean, but the agreement, the Pretoria Agreement, had about 15 articles. Not everything is important. Some are formalities, some are protocols, some are referring to modalities of implementation, but I think the important ones are about 7 or 8. So let me try to outline that first. The first one is, because it was war, the first and important part of that agreement is the permanent cessation of hostilities. The document itself, the wording of the document says that there will be an agreement to forbid all forms of hostilities. That includes direct and indirect forms of hostilities that had gone on over the 2 years of the course of the war. That includes the proxy wars that were conducted or not conducted, or part of the propaganda, or else I don't quite know, but it forbids continuation of proxy wars, forbids hate speech, and other forms of violence. Second is the protection of civilians based on the Ethiopian constitution and other international instruments of human rights, including gender-based violence, sexual and other forms of violence against women and girls. It tries to prevent that as well. It allows humanitarian access, unfettered humanitarian access, to flow into Tigray to lift the siege that had been in place before the outbreak of the war, and of course during the war. And the fourth is about the disarmament and demobilization and reintegration of Tigrayan forces. And others are about confidence building measures that the TPLF, one of the signatories, by the way, which is important to underscore that this was an agreement between the federal government and the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Those are the 2 signatories on the agreement. It outlines what the TPLF agreed to and what the federal government was agreed to do on their part. Another important article to highlight is that international boundaries and the federal facilities would be accessible to the federal forces. That is to say that the federal government is going to deploy its forces on the borders between Tigray and another country, an international or a neighboring country, which is about international borders. Another is the restoration of federal authority in Tigray, and also important is the restoration of Tigray in federal representation. And of course, the final one is the monitoring, verification, and compliance. These were outlined, about 7 or 8 points that could be categorized as important. Have they been implemented? And to what extent have they been implemented? The first thing is about the cessation of hostilities. this agreement was basically ceasefire and permanent cessation of hostilities. What is important about the cessation of hostilities is that bullets are not flying. Violence has stopped in all its forms. If we rely on the information that we have right today, there are no bullets flying from both sides. There may be some skirmishes here and there, unintended or voluntarily done at the local level. There may be some skirmishes also on the international border, but in general, we could say that the ceasefire aspect is holding. The cessation of hostilities is still in place, but as long as the political problems that actually led to the war itself in the first place, as long as those are not being settled, it's difficult to say that the cessation of hostilities has become permanent. With regard to disarmament and the withdrawal, it looks like, from what I remember, in December 2022, a month after the signing of the agreement, that the two sides met in Shire, in Tigray region, and the commander of the TDF announced that about more than 2/3 of the Ethiopian forces have withdrawn from their places, their commanding places, or the areas that they are occupied as a fighting force. Another aspect about disarmament is the withdrawal of Amhara and Eritrea forces. This has not happened, basically. The Amhara forces are still in control of the areas of Tigray, the constitutional boundaries of Tigray, in western Tigray and southern Tigray and southwestern Tigray. To some extent, that has been tried to effect the withdrawal of Amhara forces from Tigray, but they remain largely in place in both places. Eritrea, they have withdrawn from places like Aksum, Adwa, but they still remain in control of a significant territory of the Tigray region in the north. Several districts are still under the control of Eritrea. Eritrea is about 80 to 100 kilometers into Tigray, but this is frozen. The Ethiopian government says, so as long as the Algiers Agreement is not violated, we're not going to do anything about it. But as far as I am concerned, and any analyst is concerned, that Eritrea is still Eritrean Defense Forces have not withdrawn totally from Tigray. An important thing about with regards to humanitarian issues is the return of refugees and dislocated persons to their places. This has been attempted in the Atlant area, but some kind of effort is also underway in western Tigray, but I cannot be sure that Tigrayan displaced persons have returned home. I don't think that has happened, but there are some reports that an attempt is being made. But in most other places where they have been displaced, they have not returned into that to their places, to their homes. And those that have returned in this Atlant area are still under threat and intimidation, and some have actually been evicted from their settlement because of the permanent and sure threat that is in place. Humanitarian access started haltingly, according to reports from the Ethiopian side. Humanitarian access or humanitarian assistance has not flowed into Tigray in its history, but the interim government head, Getachew Reda, at the time was saying that this was just plucked from thin air. I think there is a lot of suffering, there is a lot of need in Tigray still, so the humanitarian access is a question mark. The restoration of services is one aspect. In that respect, also, the banks are probably working in most places in Tigray. Electricity, water, and other services have returned. Federal government have offices or agencies are all in Tigray, for instance, issuing passports. That is an area that I quite cannot tell, because there are no reports as far as progress is concerned and the extent to which it is implemented. But more or less, services have returned in place. About Tigrayan representation in the federal government, I don't think anything has been done about that. Tigray is not still represented. The only thing that is connecting Tigray to Ethiopia today is the Pretoria Agreement. The Pretoria Agreement, to conclude my remark here, that it rekindled hope not only in returning Tigray to peace and cessation of hostilities between Tigrayan forces and the federal government and other combatants that were engaged in that war, as long as I said earlier, as long as the political problems that led to the war in the first place have not been resolved, the hope is still hope. It has not materialized. Another hope is that what was done in Tigray after this insidious war, this genocidal war that was waged against Tigray, that the attempt to resolve political problems through military means, that the failure of that deployment of military force to resolve political problems is something that should not be attempted. That there was hope that the people would return, the Ethiopian government would return to the negotiating table to resolve political problems through dialogue. That's a big disappointment. That hope has resulted in despair because war actually continued in the Amhara region, still raging in the Oromia region, even though in the Oromia region that war started before the Tigrayan war. So there is a mixed bag as far as this Pretoria Agreement is concerned. There is many unfulfilled hopes. There are many unfulfilled provisions of the agreement, but some have already been implemented. But the most important thing is that for this to become a permanent cessation of hostilities and return of peace to the country, the political problems that led to the constitutional problems, the right problems, the economic justice problems, all of this has not been addressed whatsoever. In that respect, the specter of another violence is still in the air.
Thank you so much, Professor, for finishing right on time. And we will have, of course, an open discussion in part 2 of our discussion. Not in order of importance, let me bring on Mr. Hone Mandefro, if you are ready, so that you can also give us your perspective of what the Pretoria Agreement means in general, and most particularly for the Amhara people, and if there is also any nexus between that flawed agreement, in quotation, and the ongoing war in the Amhara region and beyond, of course. Mr. Hone, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Mogas. And I think Professor Eskal has done a good job in terms of summarizing what the agreement says. And I think that's an important context for our discussion. But I would like to go beyond what the agreement says to talk about the intent and the outcomes the agreement was hoping to achieve. As far as I'm concerned, and certainly as far as the larger Amhara public is concerned, Pretoria deal was not a peace agreement. It was certainly an agreement about ending hostilities, but hostilities between two parties of the northern Ethiopia war. And these two parties are Prosperity Party and Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. There was an intent both by the signatories as well as the sponsors of the deal for these parties to end hostilities and form an alliance. But this alliance is meant to instigate a war on Amharas. That's why I think there was a staunch refusal or a very, strong resistance to Amhara's call for participation in the negotiation process, despite establishing, a delegation, despite announcing that way before the deal was signed, there was a strong resistance by both the sponsors and the signatories to having Amharas in the talk. And for us, that is a strong indication that this was just an attempt to establish a new war pact against Amharas. And what has unfolded since this deal was signed is a proof to that intent. If we can look into what followed the peace agreement or the cessation of hostilities agreement, essentially both TPLF and Abiy turned their guns against Amharas. Right after the deal, there was an attempt to singularly disarm Amharas, both the Amhara Special Forces, but also the Fano forces. There was a quick attempt to intimidate and kind of go after active political conscious Amharas throughout Ethiopia, and that has led to mass arrest of politicians, activists, and journalists of Amhara origin. Obviously, that resulted in a large protest within Amhara region across dozens of cities, and that again intensified the violence against Amharas, leading into killing and arrest of unarmed civilians that came out to protest the Abiy region. And essentially, this result or this intent to disarm Amharas and go after them extended the violence from a certain area in northern Ethiopia to a much wider Ethiopia, and including to central Ethiopia, mainly Shoa areas. And it brought the tension to Addis Ababa and to areas within Amhara region, within Oromia region, I would say. So given that there was no intention to bring all actors of the northern Ethiopia or parties of that fighting in northern Ethiopia, including Eritrea, given that there was, a very collegial relationship that emerged out of these fighters, as was demonstrated in the case of Nairobi Agreement signed right after, a couple of weeks after the Pretoria deal. And in light of what we have witnessed in Amhara region and across Addis Ababa and other parts of Ethiopia, this cessation of hostilities agreement was never meant to bring peace in Ethiopia. It was not aimed at bringing peace to the country. It did aim at subjugating and silencing Amharas. And in that regard, there was a strong attempt to implementation. But did the signatories achieve the outcome they intended, even in relation to subjugating Amharas and, ensuring TPLF and Abiy turned their guns against Amharas and kind of ensure that, there's certain outcome, including saving TPLF, including the constitutional framework that both TPLF and Oromo Prosperity Party agree and allege to in terms of maintaining, peace and security and disarming Amharas, that they didn't achieve. But that was because of the miscalculation both signatories and sponsors of this deal had in relation to the design, the desire and determination of Amhara people to fight back and ensure that whatever alliance that is intended to wage war against Amharas will be resisted heavily. And I guess the war in Amhara region is a result of the Pretoria Agreement. It was intended that Amharas will be quickly disarmed, they will be sidelined, and then a number of publicly agreed and privately agreed deals between the two parties will be implemented. But that was prevented, not because of, obviously the lack of intent by the TPLF and Oromo Prosperity Party, but a strong resistance of Amhara people. So for us, I think the Pretoria Agreement was not intended to bring peace. It only expanded the geographical scope of the fighting. Yes, obviously the guns are silenced in Tigray, and that's a good thing. But the area where the guns are raging now is much wider than where the fighting was happening during that time. The number of people that are in need of humanitarian aid has tripled, if not more than that, compared to what was needed, what was back then. The number of people that are out of school or children out of school has dramatically increased. The number of housing institutions, educational institutions that are disseminated through drone attacks has increased. And through all this, both the signatories and the sponsors are quiet. And if you remember, when the fighting in Amhara region started, particularly State Department came on with a strong statement saying, like, encouraging Abiy to go after Amharas. Anyone who have seen that tweet would recognize that this was the war in Amhara region was designed partly through the Pretoria Agreement. So this idea that there was an intention to bring lasting peace through Pretoria Agreement, I think it's a wish, mainly among Ethiopians, but never was the intent of the parties who signed the agreement. They publicly came and admitted, if we look into what TPLF generals have said, why they signed the deal and what tactical and strategical goals they want to achieve in terms of, getting parties to fight each other and all that, but also in terms of what the response from the West has been. So the idea that there was an attempt to bring, or the intention to bring, lasting peace through this agreement is, I think, a kind of wishful thinking, mainly from Ethiopians who recognize how this continued war has devastated the country. But I think it was not the intent of the actors mainly. In terms of the deal and what has been implemented, a number of other commentators have paid attention to what the provision has said in terms of ensuring peace, ensuring that there's only one national force and all that. But look at what the federal government disarmament. There was never an intention to disarm TPLF fighters. Openly the regime has encouraged TPLF generals to continue their armed forces, to have the weapons they need, and increasingly enticing them to engage in a war against Amharas in Amhara region. And as you have seen from news reporting, there are former TPLF generals that are now captured within Amhara region as part of the commanders for the federal army. So this also is further an indication that whatever was written there, that was just a smoke screen. That was just a cover-up. The real intention was a new alliance, a new war front, a new fighting, a new people to target, and that intent is carefully, pursued. But the outcomes that the signatories achieved or wanted to achieve has not been achieved, primarily because of the resistance from Amhara forces, and I think the miscalculation they had in relation to what the Amhara forces were capable of in terms of ensuring that the Amharas who are denied of a chance at the table will pursue their interests and defend their people in the other way that's possible. That's the only way possible, which is through kindness. Unfortunately, that's what we're seeing, and I guess, yes, I agree with Professor Ezekiel that it's a mixed bag. Yes, it's a mixed bag in terms of, in a sense, like some people, some areas are quiet, but the other areas where this deal by design wanted to extend the fighting are going through a very intense fighting, but that is not by accident, but a design and an outcome of this deal.
Thanks so much. But I have a couple of questions which I will pose to you in the coming sessions. But a quick fact check, Hone, before we proceed to other speakers. You mentioned that it is a war pact, and one of the proof for that is the TPLF participated in a war in the war effort against the Amhara people. But on the other hand, we have been hearing time and again that the TPLF actually have refused, right, both officially and clandestinely, any invitation to join the foray. This is not a question; it's just a fact to check. I have other questions in our in part 2. So, what would you say about that?
I mean, if you are talking about like a full-blown war TPLF is involved, yes, they're not involved in that, and they do that for their own reason. If you remember what the generals have said, the goal is first to weaken the Amharas by helping Abiy go after them, and then eventually, when that goal is happened, they will go into a direct fighting against the Amharas. But if you see what's happening in Raya, in Talant, what is TPLF doing in those areas? What are TPLF generals that are captured in Gojam are doing? They are fighting against Hamas. We can debate what the scale of their involvement. Obviously, it could have been much more intense than that we have seen so far. But that does not mean there is no intent to go after Amharas. That does not mean they are not fighting and displacing thousands of Amharas from Raya and Talat. So those are acts of war. What else could you, what kind of description would you give, other than an act of war when a group of fighters from TPLF in collaboration with NDF forces took over Raya and kind of drove a large segment of Amharas out of that area, kill protesters that are demanding TPLF to leave the area, turn schools into campus, and kind of parade cities with cars that have heavy machinery on top of them. So the scale could be smaller, but that's a different conversation, and they have a reason. But if the question is TPLF involved in a war of act against Amhara since the agreement of this deal? Definitely, I would say yes.
Okay, thanks so much. We will leave the remaining issues for our upcoming open discussion. Then I have to divide between Faisal and Yared now. I was trying to follow the alphabet, and they all are from F to G and H. So if I do that, Yared is going to be the last. I don't know, Mr. Faisal, would you like to go first, or? Yeah, okay, Faisal.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I say hi to everybody here. And I will not really go back into the details of the Pretoria Agreement. I think my friend Scale did a wonderful job to paraphrase that. But what is in the Pretoria Agreement and what it is not, I think that was one of the questions that you raised. Just quick highlight, I was in Nairobi when the two parties were signing the last phase of that agreement in 2022. And one thing, I wrote an article following that, and I argued that if these leaders of the two sides are so friendly, drinking whiskey together, because I was having lunch at the restaurant where they had this big, fanfare, I was just reflecting as to why did they go through close to 1 million people perishing and an entire infrastructure of a region just to the tune of $30 billion, at least as estimated, to be lost. And that question still hangs over my head. And then following that agreement, I gave an interview to the Al Jazeera English program, and basically I welcomed the cessation of hostility, which was signed at that time, 2 years after the war devastated. And despite the agreement, the conflict landscape of Ethiopia's northern part, as well as Oromia, is also very worrisome, as you can look into what's happening at the political level in Tigray, what's happening in the Amhara region with the Fano, and the all as a non-stop war. So the agreement came, as most of us probably would agree, that on the heels of losing anywhere between 600,000 people to 1 million, with the largest, and I like to emphasize these facts because they help us understand what went through, the largest weaponization of sex against women and girls and elderly women during the conflict. Human rights groups throughout the world have registered this, documented, and this will be part of Ethiopia's history, whether somebody likes it or not. This is really equivalent to the historical analysis that people talk about in terms of what went in Ethiopia during the feudal time, during the Red Terror, and what have you. So this, what had happened, cannot be ignored. Was TDF and TPLF at the time of signing the Pretoria Agreement in good condition? I think that needs to be dug deeper to get the answer. But I recall a week or so prior to signing the agreement, General Zarkan held a closed circuit type Zoom meeting with Western political commentators and NGOs. And I remember Zarkan painfully expressing to the listeners that TDF was running out of ammunition. The Eritrean troops were coming from the northeastern side of Mekelle, and ENDF troops were closing on Mekelle. Whether TPLF and TDF would have surrendered to the Ethiopian National Defense Force, I cannot say that. What General Zarkan expressed is a gloom and really desperate situation that was befallen on the forces of Tigray and the ones that were trying to fight against the ENDF. And the agreement came as a result of a fear that once again ENDF would walk into Mekelle with heavy armaments and power, where we cannot tell. But nonetheless, the Pretoria Agreement came and it was signed, and most of us welcomed, for the very reason that Askayal and my other colleague expressed, that it really silenced the guns, and by far the guns are silent in Tigray. But on the loop side of that issue, are the guns really silenced in the greater context of the war in what some people call northern Ethiopia? Because it's very difficult to deny that other parties were playing a role in the war. And what comes to mind is the Amhara groups, who were part of the coalition of the government, who did their own part in terms of fighting against the TDF, as well as human rights groups have registered and documented in terms of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And in the case of the federal government, the genocide aspect of it legally to be determined. But if you really take the longer view of the Pretoria Agreement, you can say it silenced the guns, but it did not really achieve what we call peace in the region, both in Tigray, because people are on one leg for peace, on the other leg for war. But when you come to the Amhara area, and the war is even worse than what it was. Some people may argue and say, as the supporters of Pretoria Agreement say often, that the Amhara Fano don't have a case in this because they were part of the government coalition and the government was representing them. Is that really a viable argument? Is the Amhara question in the overall Tigray war the same as, say, the Somali region, where Mustafa Umar was always throwing negative words and his support against his support behind the federal government, but never sent any troops or never lifted a finger, whereas the Amhara region was involved heavily, as much as ENDF or TDF were involved in the war. So if they say the government didn't represent us, if they say the former deputy prime minister didn't reflect their intent in the war, whether that intent was to destroy Tigray or to recapture some of the land from Tigray, or to whatever their cause was in siding with the government of Ethiopia, they were players. So the question of whether the Ethiopian government and ENDF and Ridwan Hussein and those people who signed on behalf of the Ethiopian government represented the Amhara Fano fighters is really a question that begs a serious answer and needs to be really addressed. I'm raising this question simply because Mogas's last question, which was, did we achieve a sustainable peace from this? No, I would say we have not. In the narrower context, yes, Tigray is today a little bit safer than what it was. The Genza are silenced, but in terms of the greater region, all the way coming to Desse and Gondar and even farther Jimma, the war is still going on in a different fashion, although not identical to what it was before. Now, the agreement, as already been suggested, have achieved some level of positive things, but I think there are nagging issues that we cannot ignore in terms of the shortcomings of what so far the agreement registered. One, there is no really strong constitutional order today in Tigray. As we have seen, there is a tripartite fight over the power in Tigray, and that tripartite group includes Addis Ababa and Aret Kilo, TPLF, and Getachew Reda's side. Today, Tigray, after the Pretoria Agreement, is constitutionally as well as in terms of governance weaker than ever before, and I don't think that was the intent of the Pretoria Agreement. I think the expectation was that 2 years after the Pretoria Agreement, Tigray would be in a good shape in terms of governance. I think another issue is the fundamental human rights in the area has not enhanced. From what we understand, regular crime, not the war crime, but the regular crime in Tigray has escalated since the Pretoria Agreement was signed and the weakened government of Getachew Reda took place. And also a new factor that we didn't know before, which is now in the thick of the conversation, is the pillage of the Tigray resources, gold and others, in an unprecedented level since the Pretoria Agreement was. And for the average Tigraynya, this is a painful story. Other issues that are lagging behind, which were covered in the agreement, are reconstruction of Tigray. No tangible reconstruction has taken place so far. Disarmament has only taken place in the big weapons, but small arms is still heavily in the hands of the fighters, and that will give you the worry of any day war breaking up or people getting up and picking up the fight, not even for against the federal government, but also within the political structure that exists in Tigray. And then the reintegration issue has been touched. There is no meaningful, and I will underline that word, reintegration achieved so far post the Pretoria Agreement. I think the big picture that glaringly looks at us when we look to Tigray today after Pretoria Agreement is the fact that the political fracture that came also following Pretoria Agreement is really something that will haunt Tigray for a while unless they resolve that in a quick manner. The weakness of the Tigray political class, the weakening of TPLF, and the heavy hand of the federal government while it's using the Pretoria Agreement cannot be ignored. Now, there is one issue that we have not really touched, which is the role of the donors who were active to foster the Pretoria Agreement, funded, coaxed twisted armies so that this can be achieved. Now, in the first 2 years of the war, and then post the Pretoria Agreement, the Western nations, particularly the United States, was very active in this. I think that has been weakened and minimized in the last 1 year. On top of that, the interlocutor of the Ethiopian envoy, if you will, Mike Amhara, has vacated his position as of, I think this Friday or last Friday, and will assume a new assignment as an ambassador for Cuba, for the United States of America. And that position is vacant. And that will tell me that by removing the envoy when the goals are still hanging up, tells me that there is a sort of losing interest of the Pretoria Agreement and what was vested in it by the Western nations, which always gave me to doubt in terms of the commitment. Remember, the reintegration and disarmament was estimated to require billions of dollars, and that money has not been collected or secured by Western nations and Western countries, particularly the United States of America. So, in a nutshell, did this bring any peace? As I said, in a limited way, yes, in Tigray, although the fear of Eritrea is still being, in the play is there, but at the same time, nobody can say we have achieved full-blown peace when the conflict and the guns of Gojam are still roaring, and Gondar and Desse are also swamped in a new form of war. Whether somebody would say the Pretoria Agreement didn't cover that is another thing, but I was one of the very few people who argued early on that for the country, for the comprehensive approach to resolve the question of war in northern Ethiopia, and particularly in Tigray, I think posthumously and hindsight, I think it would have been helpful to have included some of the groups that were party to the war. I'm not saying supporting ENDF from afar, like the Somali region, which always sent congratulatory message to the Ethiopian forces when they defeat TDF or this and that, but the Amhara and Afar groups that were involved, that have been directly impacted by the war, I think it could have resulted, and this is my own opinion, and I said, Getachew knows this so many times before now, that it would have helped everything. And today, the Pretoria Agreement could have been on a stronger position, except with the reintegration and disarmament. Those are other issues, but in terms of not having probably a war, a new front in the Amhara region, I think in a limited form, I can argue that could have been achieved. Now, the big thing, I think, again, Skal mentioned, up to today, as far as we know, the Tigray government is not part of the Ethiopian federal system. It has no representation whatsoever. At the lower house, at the upper house, at the executive branch of the government, it's a quasi-independent, or if you will, and I don't want to use that word, but I don't have any other word to use. Ethiopia just administers today Tigray as an extraterritorial kind of way, the same way that colonial countries used to administer a far-flung region that they have some jurisdiction. Of course, Addis Ababa has some jurisdiction over Tigray, but from constitutional point of view, from the point of Article 45, which really guarantees that federal government should represent and comprise itself of all the Ethiopian regions and language and what have you. Tigray has no role in that, and that is also a shortcoming of the Pretoria Agreement, because it has not stipulated, in my opinion, that 2 years into the agreement, a major region of the Ethiopian system will be outside the jurisdiction of Addis Ababa. And with my conclusion, I would say that after the war, when you look around, you wonder what Tigray leaders have benefited from that war that was either imposed on them, as some people argue, and I argue that the war was imposed on them, or some people who took the government's version who say that the war was instigated because of the Tigray forces attacking the northern camps of the Ethiopian troops, which I don't think so, in my opinion personally. But when one looks at it today, Tigray lost a lot of the regional autonomous powers that it used to have in a different way, in the sense that Getachew Reda was handpicked. And this is something that most of us really downplay for whatever reason. Getachew Reda was handpicked by Abiy, and he refused any other person proposed by TPLF, whether one person likes TPLF or not. This is a heavy hand from Addis Ababa, which really shows us that the federal constitution that Ethiopia is accepted in 1995 is no longer practiced either in Tigray or in Amhara region or in Somali region. The equalization of subjugation of all the Ethiopian regions has been concluded, with the Tigray region now being forced to be in the web of Addis Ababa's political game. And with that, I will stop.
Okay, thanks so much, Faisal. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Yared, and then we'll come back to Getachew. So Yared, you have the floor, and you have also the same minutes to present your perspective.
Okay, thank you, Mogas, for organizing this high-level panel, and I'm very honored to be here with colleagues. I would like to greet you all. I think my task is now very limited because thanks to all the panelists who speaks before me, and especially Professor Skell, he paraphrased the agreement, the document very well, and he put all the key issues in a well articulated way. So and also thank you, Faisal and Hona, to raise most of my concerns and also key issues. So I don't want to repeat those areas that been covered. So I'm going to talk about the human rights aspect of this document, as Mogas already gave me this assignment to see from the human rights perspective. So this agreement, after both sides agreed, but it started from the preamble that there is a dedication and political will from both sides to ending the ongoing violations of human rights on a mass scale, and to ensure accountability for all atrocities and abuses of human rights violations during the conflict and also in the post-conflict situation. The preamble clearly stated that the parties who signed this agreement, mindful of desire of the people of Ethiopia to live in peace and dignity in an inclusive democratic society based on justice, equality, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. So it started from the preamble that this peace agreement is, in this peace agreement, human right is considered as a central normative backbones of the negotiation, the peace resettlement. Let me go through some of the key articles which human rights issues were reflected, like Article 1. The objective of the agreement clearly said that provide a framework to ensure accountability for matters arising out of these conflicts, mainly the issue of human rights and the accountability issue. And the same human rights issue also reflected on under Article 2, the principle of this agreement underpinning. It's for the respect of fundamental human rights, democratic norms and principles, protection of civilians, accountability and justice in accordance with the constitution of the country, and the EU transitional justice policy framework, and unhindered humanitarian access to all in need of access. So, but we can see also Article 4, the protection of civilians. The parties shall protect the human rights of civilians, population, and commit to upholding applicable international humanitarian law and instruments. So it goes on, and I can mention, but the other most important part of this agreement is the part which talks about transitional measures. The government of Ethiopia shall implement a comprehensive national transitional justice process, which later, after the signing of this agreement, the government established an independent experts who were busy on drafting the transitional justice policy. I will come later on that. But after signing of this Pretoria Agreement, what looks like the situation, the human rights situation in the ground, I think that's the most important part of my presentation, because well, this peace agreement has improved for civilians in Tigray just because of the end of hostility and because of the ceasefire. But the situation, the atrocity and the level of casualty and the human rights abuses in the region was still reflected in each part of Tigray. Many of my colleagues traveled to the region. I have read many, not some of them are not yet published, but I read many assessment reports about the level of the casualty and the atrocities and the suffering in the ground. So the human rights abuses is still ongoing and not well addressed yet. And most of the human rights abuses are not well documented. And the restoration of full service of government institutions, service provider institutions are not fully restored. In general, the human rights violation and the human rights crisis, the humanitarian crisis as well, remains as a very challenging issue in the region. When we see the impact of the war and the conflict, as Faisal mentioned earlier, more than 500,000, many reporters indicate that, claim that more than 600,000 civilians, Tigrayans, were killed. And the number of the disability in the region increased by more than 30% before the conflict. People are still struggling to obtain basic needs, and the humanitarian access, even though it was opened, but still there is a shortage of humanitarian access in the region. So the human rights crisis and the rape and sexual violence against women and children is still, we have recent documents that these kind of violations are still continued in the region. So when I was expecting from this peace agreement that the two parties, in addition to the end of hostility and ceasefire, we were expecting that an independent inquiry commission would be assigned to investigate and document and monitor the human rights abuses that was happened in the region, but that's not the case. The transitional justice process was fully controlled by the federal government, and it's under the Ministry of Justice. The whole process were excluded Tigray, as far as I know. I met many colleagues and civilians and people from Tigray region. First of all, they don't trust on the process because they believe that the federal government is one of the parties who's involved in the conflict and who create all these atrocities. So they still looking for an independent body to play this role of controlling the whole process of the transitional justice and the monitoring and documentation of the human rights abuses in the region. The rest, most of the issues, the disarmament issue and the rehabilitation issues are already mentioned by colleagues. The one interesting article of provision of this agreement, Article 11 on monitoring and verification and compliance, it's a very vague provision because in many other countries, peace agreement, the UN human rights bodies are clearly play a role to monitor and investigate and control even the whole process, to monitor the whole process of even the transitional justice process, starting from documenting the violation and also the accountability issue. So we are very far from the accountability issue, and also bring a full package of peace to the region. I think let me stop here, and maybe I will get back with questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yared, for your brief information and perspectives. Yes, we will have an open panel for that in coming few minutes. Now the floor is for not last and the least, Getachew Tamara. Getachew will also provide us with his own insights and perspectives, as well as what is really going on in the Tigray, especially since he knows what is happening there on the ground. Getachew, the floor is yours. You will have the same minutes to provide your perspectives.
Thank you very much, Mogas. And it's also my honor to be included in this distinguished panelists. In the interest of time and in the interest of not to repeat myself, Professor Haskell has laid down the framework of the peace agreement, and the other panelists have also reinforced many aspects of the cessation of hostility signed 2 years ago. However, I would like to state that whether this is a peace agreement or a cessation of hostilities, it depends upon how we interpret, the agreement into the realities of the then hostility. This is to say, in all aspects, when the Pretoria cessation of hostilities was signed, the intention was to put an end to the deadly genocidal war of Tigray, and the stakeholders in that agreement were from the very beginning clear. The Ethiopian government has entered into the agreement representing the factions or parties under its position at that time. So I do not really want to go back and forth and try to lay down, especially the factually erroneous statements I heard before. For instance, neither the Tigrayans nor TPLF have participated in the ongoing war in Amhara. This must be clear. And in many ways, no any TPLF general nor Tigrayan general have been participated in the war. We need to lay down, the facts, and then it could be helpful to understand, the outcomes of the cessation of hostility. But before going to the details of my some of my rebuttals to the statement, it is critically important to evaluate what is happening on ground in Tigray and in Ethiopia as well. Right now, after 2 years, the region is still under interim administration. The interim administration is not fully functional because of different reasons. And the cessation of hostility agreement has not been implemented, mostly because of the reluctance of the federal government in many terms. This includes, not to repeat the big issues Professor Scale, Faisal, and other colleagues raised here, but for instance, integrating Tigray into the federal structure, into constitutional structure, is a big issue of the agreement. It has not yet implemented, and this created that the region is now with lack of autonomy in many ways. It also contributed to lack of structural governance in the region. Whether the federal government likes it or not, or is working hard to postpone the status quo in the region for this purpose, the civilians, victims of the war, are still suffering, either in humanitarian crisis or because of lack of justice in many aspects. And if we are going to criticize, the agreement from its birth, one of the defects of the agreement was the lack of robust transnational justice, mechanisms. Even if the war is one of the deadly wars during the 21st century, according to credible, data from different international organizations, but the agreement kind of put the idea of transnational justice, or give the idea of transnational justice to the Ethiopian government, and in that regard, there is no any progress in many ways. In Tigray, there are some efforts. For instance, the Tigray Genocide Commission inquiry is doing some works with regard documentation and some additional efforts. But in terms of comprehensive transnational justice, there is no any movement. So that is also deficiency of the cessation of hostility, I would say, from the very beginning. And the other thing that I would like to stress is we need to interpret the cessation of hostility in a meaningful way, in the meaning that is intended to bring meaning to the agreement. For instance, when the cessation of hostilities was signed, there were voices coming from the Amhara region or even, other areas outside of Ethiopia, I would say, saying this cessation facility has not represented us, has not included our voices. Within these 2 years, with all its challenges, the Tigrayans have not attempted to go to war with the Amhara region or the Amhara forces. But still, the response that we get, the Tigrayans get from the Amhara side, not to hastily generalize all of the voices, but mostly the voices who are active in the political landscape or in the ongoing war, is as Tigray is still aggressive, belligerent. Even if the region has faced one of the very horrific crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, potentially genocide crimes, even by the Amhara forces. So I think while we are remembering, this day as the day of, cessation of hostility, but still, as long as the Amhara forces in the big picture or the big elephant in the room, the Eritrean regime is in power or is still continuing, invading the territories of Tigray, the conflict could flare up at any time. And in terms of assessing the outcomes at this time, mostly after 2 years, we would have seen a meaningful political dialogue based on the terms of the agreement. There is no any political dialogue that also is associated mostly to the reluctance of the federal government. So in the interest of time and not to repeat myself, these are the points I would like to add to the discussion. But if the panel or the mod allows me, I would also like to respond to some of the very, factually erroneous assessments by one of the participants, colleague on Mandafra.
Thank you so much, Getachew. That is why we have the open session. So yeah, you can provide your interpretation of the facts. You can also even pose questions to each other. I also have some questions. So it is better if we stick to time, and then you can do the rebuttal or anything you want in session 2, which we are transitioning into. So you can keep your questions and presentations to session 2, if you agree. I think that would be better.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
All right. So thanks so much, all of you, for making very insightful and comprehensive presentations and your perspective on how do we remember the Pretoria Agreement after 2 years and what it really means. I actually have a question or reservation. One of you have already touched up on it. This is going to be very general now, so we are already into session 2. You can ask questions, anyone can interject. But first of all, let me ask my own question. The first one is, can we really call it a peace agreement per se? Is it a peace agreement? Because in the nomenclature itself, it says a permanent cessation of hostilities, while on the other hand, of course, the content of the agreement seems that it's somehow quasi-peace agreement, because there are issues which are included in the Pretoria Agreement beyond the cessation of hostilities. So I just want you to, all of you, to reflect on that, because that is one of my first question, what it is and what it is not. And the two, most of you have already highlighted the fault lines of the Pretoria Agreement, including the stakeholders who would have been included or who are willfully excluded from the Pretoria Agreement, or at least their voices have been, concerns should have been included in that agreement. For example, Honor raised that, Mr. Faisal also alluded to that fact. I've also written on a similar similar line of arguments a couple of years ago on this issue. For example, whether we like it or not, for good or bad, the Amhara and Eritrean forces are not only spoilers, but they are stakeholders. So that is another issue. So who is responsible for the poor implementation of the Pretoria Agreement? Because most of you have touched that some of the pillars of the Pretoria Agreement has not been implemented at all, or at least fully implemented. That's my second general question. Especially, we haven't touched upon the international community, the role of the international community in this regard, apart from what Mr. Faisal talked about regarding, in quotation, the guardian of the Pretoria Agreement, Mr. Mike Hammer. I mean, does the Pretoria Agreement has a guarantor? For example, so many agreements that I have known usually have the guarantor, either the European Union or the United States or African Union serve as a guarantor. But the Pretoria Agreement, it is a very loose structure within that. So that's related to the international community. And finally, the TPLF just issued a statement yesterday night, whereby, among other things, they attributed the poor implementation of the Pretoria Agreement to three major factors. One, they said the future of the Pretoria Agreement itself hangs in the balance. That's what they said. And then they pointed out three major factors. The first one, they said the federal government's reluctance or lack of political commitment. They said the crisis within the TPLF, the political crisis. And lastly, the international community have paid just a lip service. So these are the major factors they from their point of view, I mean, the TPLF, Debrecen faction have voiced. So what do you think? What do you think the responsible factors or actors behind the poor implementation of the Pretoria Agreement? These are just three major general issues that I would like each and any one of you to address. But of course, you can also add any other issues, and including what Getachew said about the rebuttal. Let me start now in a different order. How can we do? Shall we follow the same pattern, or maybe I can pick someone? Let me start with Faisal now. So, Mr. Faisal, I will start with you, and then we come to Hone and Getachew.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you have raised a lot of questions, and I probably would start with the last question: who is responsible for the Fed, the Tigray forces? I remember that's what you said, and then the federal government and the international. I think the main weakness of this agreement, I would say two, in my opinion. One, it was done hastily, and as it indicates now, and we see the result, how to silence the guns. The entire world was ashamed of what was happening in Tigray. I think the AU was not trusted in terms of its leadership to see the world is now, particularly African issues that are structured in the eyes of the international world in such a way that you come through the ranks and layers of regional government. So IGAD would have been the first one that they were watching to resolve the issue. Then after IGAD was AU, and from many reports that we understand, both those entities were corrupt and they were under the spell of Addis Ababa. So they watched while people were bleeding in Tigray and crimes were happening. Then the other international, the Western world. So I think the whole role of the Western countries that they were ashamed of, that the NGOs and human rights groups were pressuring. So let's do something. So that it was done in hastily. Why am I saying it was done in hastily? Any other, and because you are a lawyer more than, at least I know, and probably Getachew, agreements like this should always be open to amendments and change and revision in case some new circumstances arise. I think if this agreement was supposed to be implemented to really address the issues that we are talking about, in terms of where it became short, what has been done, what is not being done after 2 years, it would have had some clause either emergency clause or interventionist clause, where we could have added some of the issues that I personally think would have helped in the implementation. A very big issue would have been, for 2 years, we haven't seen funds being raised for the rehabilitation, reconstruction, and reintegration. That issue, those 3 issues that seem to have been completely abandoned. The other issue is and I'm not speaking really on behalf of the FANO, but I think we're talking about peace, bringing peace. I think for 2 years, the war in the FANO area has escalated now too much also potentially what has happened in Tigray. So if there was an amendment clause, given the shouting, given the demand, given the cry, somebody would have probably raised and say, why don't you expand it and include? I don't understand the reason why it was limited now in hindsight, except that the war was taking place in Tigray mainly, and TDF and ENDF were the main partners. But there were other players. So for comprehensiveness in hindsight, and today what we are doing is mainly evaluating what has been done in the right way versus what has been in the wrong way. I think what has been done in the wrong way, and it still seems to be wrong, is to not have included those 2 groups, at least Afar and Amhara. Somebody would say like Ola, because Ola was never party to this conflict and the bloodletting that was happening in northern Ethiopia. That's number 1. Number 2, I think the West got its main objective from this. The West's main objective was never to reconstruct Ethiopia's state or, good governance in Tigray in Ethiopia. No. When you talk to American politicians, they will tell you and say, there is nothing we can do about what's happening in Ethiopia except lay the foundation and have people talk. That's after they talk, they walk away from this. So what happened after the agreement is that the Fed, I think it was mentioned by Getachew and others, the Fed completely took over the process. TPLF, TDF, or whatever is left, and now TSF, is only a spectator. As I said earlier, today Tigray is the same as Somali region, the same as Benishangul region, where Abiy, on the stroke of his pen, says, I can pick the president of the region. And he can literally say, I don't want so and so and so. So I think, at the international level, they got the objective, but what was good for Ethiopia has not been, gained. And then this whole agreement is a violation, I think, of one of the clauses and articles of the Ethiopian constitution, which was mentioned, I think, which says that the Ethiopian constitution protects and recognizes issues of crimes against humanity and war crime. I think crimes against humanity. The biggest crime against humanity has taken place. It's a violation of the Ethiopian constitution, and nobody has been held responsible so far. 2 years after the agreement is established, even the notion of transitional justice has been trashed by Addis Ababa and replaced that with national dialogue. So don't expect, and they sold that idea of national dialogue to take place. The role of transitional justice has been sold to Washington. Washington is funding the national dialogue. The State Department hired a special lawyer working with the federal government. So the whole concept of transitional justice, which would have been a basis for this agreement, is null and void as we speak today. And the people of Tigray, and for that matter, other people who were wronged in the war, had no recourse except to watch what the federal government does. And I think all of us probably see by now that the federal government today is much stronger in its powers vis-a-vis Tigray than what it was in 2018. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Horner, you can also briefly reflect on what I just posed, so that others will also have time to reflect on the same issue, and then we'll go to other issues.
Yeah, I think I'll a couple of pointers in relation to some allegations that I made as false statements. I think in relation to the involvement of Tigrayan fighters, for those of us who are following what's happening on the ground regularly, and I believe many of you on this panel are, there's ample evidence to point out TPF's involvement in the war in Amhara region. Just shared something on the chat, primarily not to say, that's the source, but I primarily wanted to put a face and a name to my claim that there are TPLF commanders that were captured in a fighting in Tigray region, and this person is Colonel Yared, I believe. But beyond that, I think, we know in October, around October 15, 2 units of TPLF fighters were sent to Raya Gopo, not Raya Lamata, Raya Gopo, which was part of Amhara region from the very beginning, to fight Fano, and 2 of their leaders were killed in that battle. I can go on and on and on. But also what's happening in Raya and Taland, the TPLF forces in collaboration with NDF are waging a war against the locals. So I think it's pretty clear that TPLF is involved in the ongoing war in Amhara region. But what scale and what objective, that we can analyze and disagree on. But the fact that TPLF forces, units, and commanders are involved is I think well documented by those who are following what's happening on the ground. And I guess in terms of some of the terminology we've been using, I understand non-Ethiopians typically use to Tigray war to refer the war in northern Ethiopia, but I think that's factually inaccurate and unfair. So I think what's happening is what we're talking about is the war in northern Ethiopia. Remember, the Amharas were forced to fight after initially TPLF attacked Amhara special forces in the border area between Amhara region and Tigray region, but also later on it expanded the fighting into Amhara region, as in addition to long-standing questions about identity in Raya and Walkite. So Amharas never fought supporting TPLF Abiy's campaign in Tigray. They had their own reasons, including the fact that there was fighting in Amhara areas, and therefore there were widespread human rights violations, as documented by international human rights organizations, that needed Amharas to defend themselves, that forced them to to pick up arms to defend themselves. But also there were decades of ongoing struggle in Raya and Walkite that we seem to forget that the fight in Tigray region, the Tigray region, if it was political, there were long-standing political issues decades before 2018 that contributed into the breakout of that fighting. So the idea that Amharas were fighting, supporting TPLF, Abiy's campaign in Tigray is inaccurate. And in fact, at least in the first instance, after Raya and Walkite areas were liberated, Fano forces didn't cross to proper Tigray. So I think I don't think that's helpful in terms of what we are doing today, in terms of, making it a debate about what happened in Tigray, because the bigger picture is war is fought, people suffered, and we all agree that there is a need for peace. And we're debating what could have been done if there was any desire to ensure, proper, long-lasting peace in the country. And in that regard, I think we need to look into the relationship between Abiy regime and Amharas prior to the fighting in northern Ethiopia, during the fighting, and even after. What's consistent throughout this time is there was never a time, other than the brief period in the early 2018, where everybody, including Amharas, were very hopeful about Abiy and were supportive. There were constant pushback against the Abiy regime. The Amharas have protested, denouncing the killings in Amhara region and accusing Abiy regime for its role, in addition to Oromo Liberation Army's role in prosecuting and killing Amharas in Oromia region. They have constantly protested throughout the war, before the war, and after. So the Amharas were never supportive of Abiy regime, because this Abiy regime essentially intensified the attack against Amharas. There was no reason to support it. This is a regime whose prime minister essentially says that, can you at least declare one day to mourn hundreds of Amharas killed in Tole? His response was, well, we're gonna plant trees so that their bodies rest under the trees. What kind of people would support a regime whose prime minister is such condescending, cold, and brutal and cruel, like Abiy Ahmed is. So this idea that Amharas were supporting Abiy and therefore part of his coalition is, I think, inaccurate. And I think that's where the major fault line and miscalculation emanates. At least the international, as long as the international community really understood the dynamics, because there was an assumption that the Amharas would not be a big challenge; they can be quickly defeated. That has proven to be false. Second, there was a confusion about the true sentiment of Amharas in relation to Abiy, at least by foreigners. So that has led into an exclusionary process. And this is coming to your question, Marcus, about why it was not implemented. Number one, I think the idea that the implementation failed is built on a premises that the agreement was intended to bring peace. As I have argued earlier, our take is this was a war pact. There was no intention to bring long-lasting peace in the broader area. So what would come out of a war pact and its implementation is a war, which we're seeing in Amhara region, which is wider in scope, much more intense, and impacting the nation at a larger scale because of the wider population and geographical area of the region, but also the proximity to the capital. Amhara region is not on one corner that you can kind of sort of try to deal separately because it's numerous levels throughout the country and including the capital. So it has essentially, by bringing war into Amhara region, it kind of the implementation of the Pretoria Agreement essentially increased the scope of the war, and that is an implementation of the agreement itself. It was not a mistake. I think while I agree with Faisal several points, I think he tends to think the lack of exclusion of Amharas from the Pretoria negotiation as an oversight or a mistake. No, it was not a mistake. It was not an oversight. It was a design, because we ourselves have insisted, including to the sponsors, as you know, to the State Department, why the Abiy regime would not be a proper representative of Amharas, and why Amhara's reason to fight against TPLF is quite different from why Abiy and TPLF are fighting. And there was a recognition of that difference in terms of what the reasons the Amharas are fighting TPLF, but there was a refusal to pressure Abiy regime and to accept proper Amhara representation in that agreement. And I think everybody here knows that had the United States demanded proper representation of Amharas, it would have happened. But rather, there was no intention. What was the alignment of interest among the US administration, the Biden administration, Abiy and TPLF was the desire to save TPLF. TPLF wanted to survive this war. They realized they are losing the war. They wanted to save themselves. Abiy wanted to save them and use them against another one that he was preparing for. And Biden administration was, for reasons that we can go into detail, was interested in ensuring that TPLF as a party would continue. Probably, if one can say, to ensure a proper representation of Tigrayans in whatever comes after that, or for its own geopolitical interest. But this alignment of interest in terms of desire to save TPLF is why the deal was signed quite quickly, hastily, as Faisal said, without thinking anything else. And because of that, it became exclusionary. It didn't address the main political reasons that led into the fighting. It didn't center accountability and transitional justice in the framework. And it kind of led into a situation where the Abiy regime was given a white paper to write whatever they want, sometimes in collaboration with TPLF, but more importantly, I think in agreement with Faisal that essentially Abiy was given a white paper to write whatever he likes and implement that in response to letting TPLF continue. So while the implementation, in the one hand, if you are thinking of like the intention of instigating war in Amhara, while that was pursued through and implemented very carefully, the deal was never intended to bring peace, and therefore there was no implementation that could come out of that deal to ensure lasting peace in the area.
Okay. Can you wrap up?
Well, I'll come back. I guess I don't want to, if I have over time,
Yeah.
I don't want to be disrespectful for anybody else. I'll stop here and I'll probably will come back.
Okay. So I called Getachew upon briefly reflect on that, but if you don't mind, we can also go with Professor Scale. Whoever wanted to go first, you can go first. Shall we start with Getachew? Okay, Getachew, you have a few minutes to reflect on my question as well as some of the issues you said you'd like to respond to.
Thank you very much. I was thinking Professor would go first, but let me address some of the points raised by Hone Mandefro. I think rewriting history is in itself part of, I would say, one of the reasons that leads to conflict in many ways. The war was not about TPLF. It was about the Tigrayans. Many civilians, innocent Tigrayans, have been killed in the war. So stopping the war by itself was not about TPLF. It was about the people. It was about the efforts in the region or in the area in Ethiopia to at least cease hostilities, and then the cessation of hostilities would lead to meaningful political dialogue. I understand the Abiy regime or government has not such intentions from the very beginning. But at the same time, portraying the cessation of hostility as a war pact between the Tigrayans and Abiy Ahmed to go to war against the Amharas is bluntly false. In the Amhara camp, we can discuss a lot of things, but for sure, the Amhara political forces have, from the very beginning, supported Abiy Ahmed to go to war against Tigray and have crossed to the heart of Tigray to rape, kill, and loot the Tigrayans. This is not a far history, like we are not talking about 100 years ago. We are talking about 2, 3, 4 years ago, with all its evidence, whether by the international community or even by our different people inside the country. If the Amharas have their own legitimate reason to go to war against the Tigrayans or against TPLF, they can. But still, the solution is political dialogue to end the conflict. My friend said the Amharas have never crossed to Tigray after capturing the territories they wanted to control. Really? I don't want to waste the time of our audience and the distinguished colleagues, but for sure, I can provide here tons of videos, statements, or evidences to assert my my statement. And I'm really sad in some way, because when I wanted to engage, especially after 2 years in this dialogue, it was my intention that at least the hostile propaganda would not come to gloss over the sufferings of the Tigrayans, on top of all, the challenges that the people have gone over. So in many ways, we can analyze, we can evaluate the Pretoria cessation of hostilities and its defects, but we can't, no one cannot rewritten, what happened during the previous 4 years. It is very clear. It is documented in many ways. And the other thing that, especially with southwest and western Tigray territories, still 1.2 million people are living in displacement camps. After 2 years. This is not because of we might argue this is because of, the Pretoria cessation of hostilities is not implemented. No, it's not. It's because the Amhara forces have controlled those areas. I mean, there is a strong temptation from the Amhara forces, I would say, that if the territories of Tigrayans or the Tigrayans want those territories, they can come with Abiy Ahmed and take them back. But in the previous 2 years, that was not the truth. From the interim administration or any political representation from Tigray, the Tigrayans are saying the federal government need to implement the agreement and transfer the territories to us, at least because of the cessation of hostilities. The restoration of the territories is a must. For instance, my friend said, some TPLF or some TDF forces have crossed to Raya Gobo or to some parts of the western Tigray. Tsalamti. I mean, it is possible to say a lot of things, but the Tigrayan forces have not crossed to that area. If it is meant to say Alamata, and that is where the few tens of thousands of Tigrayan displaced persons have returned to that place, the Ethiopian National Defense personnel were there in the area, and so what I'm trying to convey here is, it is possible to evaluate and assess the cessation of hostilities and its defects in a way that helps us to reach a meaningful, peace deal. But it is not helpful to interpret, the elements or the outcomes of the cessation of hostilities in terms that they are, distorted. In terms, it is saying it is a war pact, between two groups. In many ways, the Tigrayans, including TPLF, if they want, cannot be allies with Abiy Ahmed because of the crimes, because of the genocidal crimes he and his administration committed, against the Tigrayans. So I think for the international community, okay.
Can you wrap up in 2 minutes? I will give you more minutes because Faisal would like to leave very soon.
Okay.
So wrap up this session in 2 minutes, and then you will come back after Faisal.
Okay, yeah. It's okay for me. I may come back.
Sorry for that. So Faisal, you can make, so looking ahead, what shall be done to bring about peace in Ethiopia, and generally provide us with your final remark before leaving.
Yeah, thank you. I had to leave. I think, in my opinion, the war did not start in 2020. I think the rupture of the war started in 2020, but I think much before that, the preparation began right away when Prime Minister Abiy took office. I recall I was in Addis Ababa in 2018 when President Isaias came, and the entire from Pole Airport all the way to the palace was just the biggest celebration that I have ever seen. And then the next day they went to Awasa, where the preparation supposedly took place. I remember traveling that June or July with a young Tigray medical doctor who worked in the Somali region, who was going for a short course to South Africa. And she told me at that time how her families, all the families from her ethnic group, Tigray, were leaving Addis Ababa in droves because of the rhetoric and the fear and everything that was expressed to them. And I think we don't have to really run away from history. I think Abiy was extremely, extremely popular and supported by the Amhara elite. That I do disagree with Hon in this. And when we say Amhara, we're not talking about the Amhara people, but from here, the No More movement, his lifeline, his political lifeline when he was conducting the war was mainly those social groups that we are talking about. But nonetheless, Somalis were involved as the regional government was the big mouth for the war with Mustafa Omar, and that is not something we can run away. As to the Amhara and the Tigray, I don't think we have to rehash that history. They have had on and off relationships all the way from Menelik and Johannes, and since the TPLF EPRP conflict is at Asimba, they haven't had good relationship, and I think that's seen all the way to the current situation. So that needs some sort of political discourse between the two of them. How do the Amhara and the Tigray elite coexist? Ascribing blame to one side or the other may not help, but I think Abiy and his supporters are completely responsible for what had happened either in Tigray or in northern Ethiopia and now in Oromia. That is really the political issue that we need to address. I don't think there is such a problem per se between Amhara and Tigray people, but the political situation. In terms of where we go from here, wars don't start simply because one side decides to. There is political, social issue embedded in this. So I think suddenly, why would the biggest war in Ethiopia start right after Prime Minister Abiy took power in 2018 with TPLF? I think he wanted to just replace their power. I think he used this, very, very draconian measures to wipe out TPLF in a way that, we haven't seen before. And I think that impacted the people of Tigray in particular, but also in general, northern Ethiopia, whether you call it Afar region or Amhara region. Those are semantics really, but we can never argue with a level of honesty that the people of Tigray didn't shoulder an unprecedented historical genocidal war. I think for the Amhara elite, they may need to accept that fact and sympathize with what had happened with the people of Tigray, and then take lessons from that for tomorrow may be their day. As we see what's happening today, what had happened in Tigray has already, if it has not happened in a full swing, has already started to happen there with the drones and the Mirages and the F-15s to be, bombed in the. So I think I would rather minimize the argument, because these books have been written on this. There is no comparison between what had happened to the people of Tigray and any other group, as far as we know, up to this point. But I think we need to take a lesson from that. We need to sympathize and empathize with that, and then also probably transfer that empathy to what's now happening in Oromia and in Amhara. Because as we see from Abiy's political goals, he will not stop for anything in order to get his goal. So I think we need to shift the discussion from the ascribing blame to more or less really reading the authentic history of what had happened and what could have happened. And thank you very much. And I really appreciate it. I had to go. I have some commitment that I made before.
Thank you so much, Mr. Faisal, for your presentation, for everything. And I hope we'll see you soon with other issues. Thank you so much. Have a good one. All right. So now we have Professor Scale to reflect on my question and some other issues that he would like to talk about. Professor, you can continue.
I guess your question is about whether the agreement, the Pretoria Agreement, it was a peace agreement or not.
That was the first question, yes. And there are other two questions, of course.
Yeah, if we're still discussing that, let me begin by speaking to the essence of the agreement based on the text of the agreement. The title, it says an agreement for a lasting peace through permanent hostilities, the permanent cessation of hostilities between the government of Ethiopia and the TPLF. So it's not a peace agreement. If you just take a look at what it says, it's not a peace agreement, but hoping that the permanent cessation of hostilities is going to lead to peace. That's probably what I can infer from that. The intention is peace, but the agreement itself is not a peace agreement. It doesn't say that it is a peace agreement. It is simply an agreement for lasting peace. How is that to be interpreted? I think Yared earlier talked about the preamble, which is basically important to refer to. In the preamble, it says that they agreed to peacefully resolve the violent conflicts between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF. It also says it affirms, or in the preamble says, the affirmation to resolve political differences by political means. It states also that it provides modalities for peaceful settlement of all political differences and disputes, and they're determined to seek peaceful and lasting solution to the crisis within the framework of the permanent cessation of hostilities. And then it lists objectives. So the preamble lays down that this is about bringing about peace in Tigray, to end the Tigray war. And I'm going to emphasize that to end the Tigray war and pave the way for the political settlement of the disputes that led to the war, and then paving the way for a lasting and permanent peace in Tigray and then in northern Ethiopia. The objectives says it's the way to the modalities to resolve the disputes in the process of peacemaking. To end the war and bring about peace, it outlines about 11 conditions. I'll separate them into two. The first one is they say restore the constitutional order. That simply means to me, to restore the constitutional order in part means that both sides agreed to return to the status quo ante, to return to the way things were, politically, economically, socially, culturally, or any other way, militarily, security-wise, to return to the status quo ante, because the war disrupted some order. So if an order was disrupted, a political order was, a constitutional order was disturbed or disrupted by a war, then the right thing to do is to return to the constitutional order as it existed before the war. That was not done. The constitution is not respected in Ethiopia today at all, as a matter of principle and as a matter of practice. Not just in Tigray, but anywhere else where there is conflict. That problem of the destruction of the constitutional order is the core problem that actually led to conflict in Tigray and elsewhere in the country. It also says reject violence as a method of resolving political differences. That means that if the Ethiopian government or the TPLF, both sides that agreed to or signed the agreement, are committing to rejecting violence as a means of solving political problems, that should not be limited to the Tigray region. If there are political problems in the Amhara region or in the Oromia region or any other region in Ethiopia, that the Ethiopian government committed through this agreement to resolving rejecting violence. Well, violence was not rejected anywhere. Maybe there is a cessation of hostilities in Tigray, but violence actually continued in other parts of Africa. So Ethiopia. That means the idea of rejection of violence, it cannot be limited to Tigray. You can't reject violence in Tigray as a means of political resolution of political conflict, and then continue to carry on in other parts of Ethiopia. That simply tells you that this was not really what the government of Ethiopia intended. The third thing is guarantee security for all. Guarantee security for all only in Tigray? And who's about to guarantee security in Tigray? I don't see the Ethiopian government presence in the region of Tigray in the number that is required to restore peace and security for all Tigrayans in Tigray. And I don't see the Ethiopian government actually committing to providing security for its citizens. More insecure insecurity in some region, it will be insecurity elsewhere. So if peace was an agreement, in Tigray, then I would see that there would be a commitment to providing security for all persons in Ethiopia. But what do we see instead in Ethiopia? Abductions, robbery, mugging, ransom demands are everywhere in Ethiopia. There is really no security for people in Tigray. In Tigray, crime in Tigray, robbery in Tigray, breaking into Tigray is probably triple what it was before the war. In terms of accountability, this is what is in there, is that you provide a framework to ensure accountability in Tigray arising from the conflict. Well, it's not really limited into Tigray. I think my friend Hone was talking about that the Amhara region and Amhara forces were involved in the Tigray. What that means is that accountability must be implemented everywhere there is conflict. That is what I think it would happen. Let's say that the spirit of the letter of the agreement was not implemented faithfully, at least on the part of one of the signatories. Now, the other thing that one should look at is that if the spirit of the agreement and the letter of the agreement was not a commitment to peace, then peace would come as a result of the work that would be put into effect in Tigray and in areas that were affected by the war. That includes what the agreement says, that to foster reconciliation and rehabilitation of social bonds. To me, that would mean that people-to-people solidarity between the warring parties in Afar, in Tigray, and in other regions as well, because I do not agree with the notion that the war was fought between only the federal government and the Amhara region. Afar was directly involved, and others also sent. This was what we were hearing, that the other regions also sent forces to fight this war. For, as it was said at the time, for the continued existence of Ethiopia, the Ethiopia alone. So everyone was involved in it. So this thing should have been binding. The reconciliation and rehabilitation effort of the social bonds that were tattered would have been a work that should have started right after the implementation, but I see no effort in that respect. The national dialogue that was in Addis Ababa is not taking place in Tigray, is not taking place in Amhara, is not taking place in other places. So the idea of reconciliation and rehabilitation has not been attended to. This is what would have led to peace. Even if the agreement doesn't say it's a peace agreement, this would have led to peace, permanent peace. Economic recovery, it says. Economic recovery and reconstruction. Of course, if people have a means for their livelihood, they would not vouch for war. That's a given. But is economic recovery underway in Tigray, for God's sakes? Is reconstruction underway in Tigray? In the Amhara region? The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission this week or last week put out a report about the effect of the war on schools, for instance. I don't have in front of me, but if I don't remember the numbers, that in Tigray itself, about 105 schools were destroyed. More than that were partially destroyed. Others are out of place, and students are not going to work. That means the idea of recovery is not underway in Tigray. And in Amhara region, about 4,400 schools are not in operation. And most of these schools in the Amhara region, which is affected by the war in the first place, in the Amhara region, are military barracks. The schools are military barracks. They are not schools. So the idea of recovery and reconstruction is actually not going on to usher in an era of peace. This will be necessary, but it's not going on. In the Oromia region, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission about schools reported that 750 are not in operation because they are either damaged or partly damaged. But the report that I got from the head of the Oromia Education Bureau, I don't want to name his name here, but Education Bureau, is that 1,661 schools are not in operation because they are partly damaged, and 501 were totally destroyed in Amhara. So where is the peace? In what sense would call that peace as a peace settlement? Now, the other thing is that the territorial in the principles section, it says that respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ethiopia. Is the Tigray region, the territorial integrity of Ethiopia in the northern part is not protected. In the western, on the Sudani side, is not still protected. In the South Sudan right, it's not protected. On the Somali side, it's not protected. So this is not really paving the way for peace. To be honest, I could go on and on critiquing what was done and what was intended and what was done. But to my understanding, I don't really think that this was a peace agreement, and it's not even implemented in a way that would usher in some semblance of peace. Having said that, let me say this and conclude. To say the intention of the agreement was not for peace, I don't know how to interpret that. I don't know what that would mean. Maybe people have some evidence, not interpretation, some evidence that the two parties did not intend peace. But it was a conspiracy to go to war against another, that the federal government and the TPLF actually conspired, not a peace agreement, but they conspired to make the Amhara region vulnerable to another attack. It's a matter of interpretation, and there are probably some grounds for making that kind of interpretation, such as, for instance, the measure the federal government instituted right after the war to disarm the special forces in the Amhara region. Yeah, you could use those kinds of evidence to make that interpretation. The Amhara are not represented. It's a curious idea to me, to be honest. Because is it an admission the Amhara region was part and parcel of the violence against Tigray? Because they were part of the war, they should be represented. They should be represented in Pretoria and not Afar and not other regions who were also parties to the conflict. I don't get that one. Maybe I probably need an answer to that. So the issue should be, if the governments and the parties to the agreement are not doing enough to bring about peace, we should do what is right to try to stop the conflict now, and push the government and other conflicting parties towards the negotiating table, so that as the horrific war in Tigray ended through negotiations, it should end through negotiations elsewhere as well, if peace is what is desirable. So our interpretation, a matter of interpretation, should be to advance the cause of peace, is what I want to say. So I'm just sticking to the idea of the text rather than the interpretation. And in that sense, what was agreed to, the way it was presented, and what was done since then does not bode well for lasting peace, as was claimed in the text.
Thank you, Professor, for such an excellent presentation and reconstruction of the agreement itself, because we tend to leapfrog most of the most fundamental principles of the agreement itself. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Before we go ahead, I think since we have a bigger fish to fry, and I believe that we have a bigger fish to fry, it's better to focus on how to bring about, for example, solidarity and to join common front and bring about, for example, accountability and peace across Ethiopia. So it would be great if we can find, we have a common cause, but if you can find a middle ground as we look ahead into the future, because we have already suffered quite a lot, and we are still remembering the Pretoria Peace Agreement and whether we have taken any lessons. That is actually one aspect of our discussion. And that is part of my question, but Professor Scale already responded to that question, because if we could have used the Pretoria Agreement actually as an opportunity to come to terms with the reality and to stop violence across the board. But it seems that 6 months after the signing of Pretoria Agreement, then we had another war, and even 9 months since the Pretoria Agreement, the negotiation which was going on between OLA and Oromo Liberation Army and the federal government could not be materialized. So we see that there is no political will or even intention to cease hostilities or violence once and for all. Thank you so much, Professor, for answering my question preemptively. So, Mr. Yared, you can also reflect on those outstanding issues or questions that have not been addressed, including any issues that you wish to highlight in this session.
Thank you, Mogas. I think let me reflect on the first question about the nature of this document, as Professor Scale well presented. But I think there are 4 types of peace agreements which is classified by the United Nations. So this document, the Pretoria Peace Agreement, it is part of the provisions are cessation of hostility and ceasefire agreements. But not only that, it is also a peace agreement. We can say, well, it is a peace agreement, which I differ from Professor, but it combines many issues. Maybe it might be one of the poor implementation. The reason for the poor implementation of this peace agreement is because of the nature of this document. It has some pre-negotiation agreements, like for what's going on the ground, how it didn't put any details, but it has some elements of pre-negotiation nature elements, and it has also a comprehensive and framework arguments. Even it says in some of the articles there are framework provisions how the African Union experts are establishing and the transitional justice issue, but it didn't go in detail. So what I was expecting from the signing of this peace agreement was the 2 parties in support of the international community and independent experts. I was expecting they sit together and develop an implementation plan, in very detailed implementation plan, rather rushing for celebrating in Addis and as if they carried all these burdens of accountability. So there is no any detailed document or plan that supports this general agreement, how it would be implemented on the ground. So I think the nature of it talks about the transitional justice, but it gives more power to despite knowing that all these tensions and the hostility, the hostility and especially the long term, as our colleague Faisal said, the war was started not the first day when the war broke out. It started some years or months before. So there is already the hostility even before the first day of the war, the conflict. So the two parties need independent expert support, especially in most cases in many countries, the United Nations and the UN Human Rights Commission and other, including the African Union, they established an independent expert body, not only monitoring the implementation of these agreements, but from zero supporting all the developing policies, documents, and all the legal framework as well. So I think this document, this agreement should be supported by other implementation plans and details, but I can see that gap in the ground. So it's a peace agreement, but the nature of this document is very, it's very limited, and also it has many vague provisions, as I said earlier, like some of the articles which discuss about the role of the international community in the implementation of this peace process. In relation to who failed to implement for the or who will be responsible for the poor implementation of this peace agreement, I think I can see that there is a downplaying of the seriousness of the crisis and the current situation of the country from the federal government side, and also it seems like the government is playing each and every incident is to build its own image, rather confronting the problem on the ground, and also it's not all inclusive approach to the situation in the country, including the situation in Amhara region, in Oromia, in Afar, and the rest of the country. It is interlinked. So I think this peace agreement couldn't bring a sustainable peace, not only in Tigray, but for the rest. I mean, not for the rest of the country, but even in Tigray, now there is a tension. So there are many unresolved issues because of the poor implementation of this peace agreement. So, well, yeah, well, let me stop here. Maybe I don't want to repeat myself again. Most of the issues are well addressed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yared. Now, before we head to the final session of our panel, I would like to give a few minutes to Hone Mendefro and Getachew Tamare, because it feels that they haven't finished their reflections. Maybe I will give you 3 minutes each, so that you can reflect on any outstanding matters that you haven't addressed in the previous session. And then, of course, any one of you can jump in after they have made their points. Maybe Hone, you have the floor, 3 minutes.
Thank you. I think there were a couple of pointers I want to talk about. One is about empathy and empathy. I think I want to start by saying that, you know, as a person, as human rights defender, obviously, I sympathize with any victim of war crimes or atrocities against any individual. And this is, I think, not just a personal stand. Actually, the organization I represent, Amhara Association of America, was among the few Ethiopian diaspora collectives that issued a statement early on denouncing atrocities against civilians. This was a statement we made in February 2021, and said regardless of which ethnic group they belong, who is the perpetrator, we denounce any atrocity against civilians. And so I do sympathize with Tigrayan civilians that are impacted by the war, and similarly, I expect, fellow panelists, but more broadly, to sympathize with what's happening in Amhara region. And this is a trend, at least from Amhara side, that we feel like we're always demanded of to empathize, to carry the burden, to be responsible for certain things, but never given the similar empathy when we go through similar atrocities. And this has been a consistent pattern, at least in the post-1960s. And this has to do with history and how Ethiopia's history has been narrated, particularly in relation to who Amharas are, who are the Amhara elites. For instance, Faisal mentioned the No More movement as a representative of Amharas. Actually, the No More movement has no relationship with Amhara movement. Just to give an example, if you see how my organization responded to the resolution that the US Congress introduced, an example, HR 6600, the No More movement opposed it. We supported it, saying that as long as it equally enforces accountability and hold all perpetrators accountable for atrocities, we support any effort to hold perpetrators accountable. We have always went on the media, accusing of Abiy regime for putting the country in a mess. And yet still, people kind of pick the voice they don't like and then assign them as an Amhara name. And I think this No More movement is led by, Tigrayans of descent, for instance, Hermela and all that. I'm not saying there are no Amharas in that movement. As any movement, there will be Amharas in many places, but I think you need to understand the broader sentiment of the Amharas, where they stand. And what transpired after Pretoria Agreement has made it clear where Amharas stand vis-a-vis Abiy. So there's a notion of misrepresenting who is the Amhara voice, who should be listened representing Amharas, and then of a constant demand for us to empathize with others while ours is downplayed and kind of that. I think it's a sentiment among Amharas. For instance, right now, more than 5,500 schools are out of operation. Drone attacks just in the past 1 month, 43 drone attacks killing hundreds of Amharas. Our organization has documented, a small diaspora organization documented, more than 5,000 civilians killed in just since the state of emergency was declared in Amhara region. So there's a lot of going on, but we don't see similar outrage from prominent voices in Amhara, in Ethiopian circle. Those who were vocal against government regime, the Abiy regime actions during the war when the fighting was in Tigray, are now either silent or supporting, or at least that's what we feel as Amharas. And I think
why do you think so?
I think we have touched upon this, Mogus, in a previous discussion with you, but there's a sentiment of refusal to recognize Amharas as a victim, because the way the country's politics has been narrated revolves around, the Amhara, an imaginary Amhara class that is dominant in Ethiopian history. The moment people recognize Amharas as a victim, the whole understanding they had about the political narration about Ethiopia collapses. There is a refusal to admit that, there was deep-rooted problem in a way how Ethiopian politics has been narrated. And there was misrepresentation of who Amhara and what Amhara's interest is, at least in the post-1960 Ethiopian politics. And I think what I would like more people to do is to pay attention to who they are portraying as an Amhara voice, what that people say and what the people want, where that fit and misalign. I think there is a lot of reckoning, reflection, many scholars and political voices need to do in terms of understanding the true extent of grievance of Amhara people and their true desire. The Amhara people have no issue with into dialogue with Tigrayans or the TPLF for that matter. In fact, That's what we've been demanding prior to 2018. Getachew would know how many Amharas were killed because they were demanding the recognition of our Walqaid Samar identity, Raya Samar identity. Why didn't TPLF listen and engage with them respectfully instead of forcing them to pick up arms when the time comes? Instead of arresting them, refusing them to even present the question to the House of Federation, arresting them in Sululta, instead of welcoming them, engaging with the question in a genuine concept. So I think there's a demand for dialogue, but dialogue requires bi-directional willingness. It cannot be demanded of one party non-stop. We have to do deeper reflections in terms of how we understand the Amharas, whether we have truly captured their sentiment and what their wishes and desires are. But then another point I want to quickly reflect is Professor Escala's question about why should Amharas be, given a separate delegation in the Pretoria peace deal. And I think that's a fair question. First, I think we were not against anyone also being represented, be that Afar or Eritrea, as long as they're active stakeholders in the fighting. I think a comprehensive peace would only emanate from a thorough representation of diverse groups that fought in the war. So we're not opposing that. But why we say Amharas should have been represented independently? One, throughout the course of the war, there was widespread atrocity against Amharas in Oromia in particular. And the response from Abiy regime was to downplay, to deny, and to even scale out those atrocities. So because of that, the Abiy regime has lost legitimacy in the eyes of the Amhara people. That's number one. Number two, no region has any issue when it comes to Raya and Walqaid, similar to that, like Amharas have over the Tigray region. That is a fundamental reason why Amharas joined fighting against the Tigrayan forces. TPLF, Tigray's Afar had similar question. I think they were also addressed in a separate discussion, but they should have brought into the panel. But I don't think we can make an equivalence between, let's say, Somali region and Amhara region in their relationship with the Tigray region. They have a different history. They don't share border. There is no contestation about identity and areas in between Somali and Afar, Somali and Tigray, for instance. But that has been a defining feature of the relationship between Tigray region and Amhara region throughout the period TPLF was ruling Ethiopia in collaboration with others, obviously. That's the second reason. The third, there were several political questions that if there was genuine desire to bring long-lasting peace into Ethiopia, that the Pretoria process should have been used. An example would be Amhara's long-standing demand for constitutional reform. That could have been discussed as an agenda in there. Amharas have a particular view when it comes to that. And that after, if we're genuinely committed to peace, I think that should have been reflected in the agendas. But more importantly, I think the identity question of Amharas is the main reason why Amharas fought, in addition to the accountability issue. Because of the lack of representation of Amharas, you can see how the Walqaid and Raya issue was presented. It was presented as a contested area. That is a TPLF talking point. Amhara's issue when it comes to Walqaid and Raya is primarily identity. The names of committees that mobilize people in those areas are named Amhara identity question, not Amhara areas. If you see Walqaid, Amhara identity question. Raya, Amhara identity question. The primary question Amharas had in those areas is, we are Amharas, we need, our identity should be recognized, and we need to have self-administration. But TPLF would like to twist this into a contestation over land, dehumanizing the people, distorting the question, and making it about economic issue rather than about the people. And I think that is an example of why the Amhara's presence and a separate delegation from Amharas would have done justice in terms of presenting the Amhara's view and what they want out of that process.
Okay, thank you. Professor, would you like to reflect? I see you nodding your head. Would you like to reflect, or am I misinterpreting your gesture?
Well, if you want me, I have some issues on the top. I agree with Mr. Yared about the. It could be interpreted as a peace process, peace agreement. That there are 4 types, but the way I understand that it's about peace process, not peace agreement. That there are 4 stages in the peace process, beginning with the cessation of hostilities, to pre-negotiation of modalities, to preliminary agreement on commitment to reach an agreement as a negotiated settlement, and then the comprehensive or the framework or comprehensive agreement. Those are part of the process. I was just looking at the text and the implementation. It doesn't amount to peace agreement that has resolved the underlying issues that actually led to peace. What I mean by that is, if those underlying issues have not been addressed, there is always the possibilities of resurgence of conflict. So in that sense, they were not addressed. But I'm not the lawyer, but I defer to you on that one. So that is with respect to the peace process. This thing about others do not recognize Amhara victim. I personally recognize that Amharas are victim to the violence that's perpetrated right now on Amhara people. That is, there are Amharas that are the bank workers that were killed in Adabarg are victims. There's no doubt about that. The teachers and other civil servants that were killed in Merawi and the children, the women, and the residents that were killed were victims. There's no doubt about that. In other places, not just by the Ethiopian forces, but also by the armed forces that are swarming in Amhara region as well. But it's not about the agreement, this agreement. That's another issue that needs another level of discussion some other time. But the issue of Al-Qaeda and Raya and Alam, these are identity questions. And the Amhara joined the war because of these identity questions. That really undercuts the argument that the Amhara activists are actually advancing. Because what it amounts to is, what you're saying by that is that we joined the war in order to recover by force and violence the land that was taken away from us constitutionally. I think if this is the goal, that's what it pretends. That is really what it pretends. If we joined the war for land to return, it's not about identity questions. The thing that I'm saying is that if there are disputes over land and identity, violence is not the way to settle it. Because there are look, Oromos could ask about the Oromia region in Amhara. They could ask about the Oromo-speaking region in Wambara. Should we go to violence to return that? See, this is not a way to proceed. It's not even a goal to proceed that taking land forcibly and through violence is not something that could be justified. So I kind of object to that idea. But I also want to say something about the Amharas that are not recognized as victims. What are we talking about here? The Amhara regional government? The Amhara people? The Amhara opposition? Or Abiys Amharas? There are Abiys Amharas in the government at high levels. Are they victims? Are there the Amharas that are suffering in the Amhara region? The peasants, the workers, and all that, I recognize that. I feel that. They should not be part of the victims. But if you're talking about the Amhara government, the Amhara regional government, the head of the Amhara regional government, the president at that time, is one who actually incited his own people to go against the people of Tigray. Now he is the president of the federation. He's the president who is actually saying that let's go against these people. The guy that is actually declared against the Tigrayans, that we should destroy them from the face of the earth, from memory, from psychological remembrance, is still in that government. So let's separate that and then make this about the people, not the collaborators with the tyrant. So I just wanted to clarify those.
Thanks so much, Professor. I'm sorry, Getachew. I know that I gave you the chance already, but when the professor was nodding, he said I wanted just to bring him in. So sorry for that. You have your time, Getachew, to reflect on what you would like to say. And then Hone, if you have any, Hone and Mr. Yared, if you have any issues to reflect, I will give you final chance, and then we'll go to the concluding remarks. Getachew, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. In terms of categorizing the agreement, whether it is a cessation of hostilities or a peace agreement, I think we need to consider the three major factors to say so. It's scope, intention, and durability. So in many ways, if we closely scrutinize the cessation of hostility, it is a cessation of hostility. It's not an agreement. I tend to agree in many ways with Professor Hasgale in his reading of the text of the cessation of hostility. It doesn't clearly say or address the causes of the genocidal war. It doesn't bring any power share arrangements. It has not also laid down ways to eternally, long-lastingly address the causes of the war. But in terms of cessation of hostilities, it has laid very strong foundations with all its deficiencies, to go out of war, to cease hostilities, and then start a meaningful political dialogue. And I think it is really tough to sometimes debate or even express ideas in such settings. In a way, for instance, when the Amhara forces joined Abiy Ahmed, not only the Amhara government, but also the paramilitary forces, even the irregular forces of the Amhara, the militia groups, were joining the army of Ethiopia in the concept of unifying Ethiopia, saving the essence, the soul of the country, not the identity of a given territory or anything. But in order not to derail, the conversation and to make it kind of to not derail the conversation, I would like to focus on the realities on the ground now. You cannot claim when you participate in the war, your issues, your demands were, taking the territories of Tigray by violence and ethnically cleansing hundreds of thousands of people. But when the time of accountability comes, or the issue of accountability is on the table, you cannot go back from that issue. So in the terms of the current status quo in Tigray, as long as the IDPs continue to live in camps, as long as over 40% of Tigrayan territories are controlled by either non-foreign forces like the Amhara forces or including the Eritrean forces, the conflict could at any time flare up, could come to existence. And I heard from the discussion that the reason why the Tigrayans, or even the saying TPLF, has not gone to war is because they don't want, as long as they are weak. Well, that is the wrong reading of the Tigray's context from the very beginning. TPLF could be weak, could be strong as a political party. But when you attack, when you ethnically cleanse, when you wage a genocidal war upon the community, whether you are a majority or not, what matters is the violence, the suffering upon the people made the people to gallantly fight and stand for their rights. That was what happened in Tigray. And even in this day, in this time, even if the people of Tigray are tired of war, violence, but as long as the issues, the autonomy, self-administration, their rights have not been ensured, the conflict might flare up. So, in my concluding remarks, it is critical to discuss, to bring peace, to start dialogue, to start reconciliation, as the Tigrayans have partially started by not going to war, even if there are 1001 reasons, factors to go to war. The war was not easy. The war was full of, crimes against humanity, all kinds of crimes. It was not only because Tigray is the region that is cornered, in one area of Ethiopia, and it was easy to kind of crush, the region and the people. That concept by itself is genocidal, by the way. Whether you are in the heart of Ethiopia, whether you have borders that cross to different regions, what matters is, are you really ready to stop violence and start meaningful dialogue in a way that benefits the people of your region and the people of other regions as part of Ethiopia? Or will the armed forces be still involved, or still are interested in continuing violence in the country? So in my perspective, Pretoria cessation of hostilities is a beginning, preliminary beginning to political dialogue. But if there is a complaint, the Tigrayans would complain far more than the others in many terms. Not because they want to go to violence, but because they want to go to peace. The majority of Tigrayans, everywhere you go now, want peace, want cessation of hostilities to bring about a meaningful political dialogue and restore the security, order, and governmental services that they wanted in the region.
Thank you so much, Getachew. And now what we do is, if Mr. Yared has anything to say, I will give him 2 minutes. And we still have 3 minutes each for concluding remarks, but you can still make it. Because I didn't give you a chance, you can do that. And then I will give 1 or 2 minutes to Hona, and then we shall conclude with our concluding remarks. Mr. Yared, if you have anything to say on the issues that have been raised.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I think the discussion and all the concerns that Hona and Getachew raised, I understand from both sides. But for me, all these issues raised is just because of the nature of the Pretoria document. If this document was restricted and framed within few provisions of focusing on the hostility of in ending hostility and ceasefire, and then maybe holding those other questions like the administrative related issues and other issues for the next phase of the negotiation process, that would be maybe this kind of discussion might not be a major issue in relation to the Pretoria Agreement. For me, this agreement should be supported with different phases of negotiation, and like after signing the ceasefire, the federal government should sit with all stakeholders, including all parties who were involved in the conflicts, and defining all the problems together, mapping the issues and how to continue, and the relationship between these regions and these conflicting areas, generating will of joint, how to find a joint solution for this administrative issue, a long-lasting issue which was not resolved for many years back, and also some exercise of scenario building and negotiation, and how to act together for the proper implementation of, for the full implementation of this peace agreement. So I think it's just this, the federal government and the Tigray regional government, they were under pressure to sign this peace agreements, but they involved also all these conflicting issues, which was not clearly stated in the peace agreement. So maybe this discussion will continue, but I don't know where we reached, because it didn't support this process, should be supported by some more engagement at the local level. The international community was focused on the ceasefire and to end the hostility, so that this document should be framed with that nature, but other phases of negotiation should be continued at the national level with the presence of all stakeholders, including the Afar regional government, the Amhara regional government, and even the document didn't say about the accountability of the Eritrean forces who are still have presence in the country. There is no any accountability to bring the Eritrean forces to be accountable for all the crimes they committed, and also for the enforcement of removing their forces from the Tigray region. So I think this discussion might be it is the result of the gaps and the vague provisions of this peace agreement. Thank you, August.
Okay, I thank you, Mr. Yared. And now we are approaching to the end of our discussion, but before we conclude, Mr. Getachew Redda, one of the signatory of the Pretoria Agreement, has already reflected on what the Pretoria Agreement really meant and what remains to be seen. He just tweeted 10 minutes ago. He said the most critical objective of the Pretoria Agreement was to silence the guns that had been raging for over 2 years with the horrific intensity across Tigray. On that score, the Pretoria Agreement has been a qualified success. That is how he stated. So for him, the primary objective of the agreement is to silence gun. But of course, he has mentioned so many outstanding issues that needs a proper attention. I'm just bringing that in because he just updated us on Twitter. With that, in retrospect, I have conducted this research 2 years ago on the public perception. I just wanted to ask you all that this diagram shows that around 63% of the Ethiopians who participated in this survey said that the Pretoria Agreement was fundamentally flawed, and again, as around 29% they said, even though there are some irregularities and concerns, it is hopeful. Around 8% said that the Pretoria Agreement is perfect. So I'm bringing this back after 2 years. So before we conclude this section, if you were to be asked the extent to which the Pretoria Agreement has been implemented, what would be your take on that? Of course, I know it's very subjective. That's my question to each and every one of you as you make your concluding remarks. So keep that as a question from me. Mr. Horn, I will give you only 90 seconds to reflect on the other outstanding issues. Then maybe let's do like this. So I will give you 5 minutes, including the concluding remarks. So reflect on what is remaining, and then you can also make your concluding remarks in the interest of time. We have already exceeded our our dedicated time already by 10 minutes.
Okay, I think I want to kind of respond to Professor Skal's question about the why Amhara's joined and how that has to do with that identity question. I think Amhara's over the last 3 decades have constantly been asking one question from Ethiopians of different origin, but also regions that rule Ethiopia. And this question is this: let us be on the table, hear us, listen to us. Don't make assumptions about us built on fictions that are out there trying to depict us wrongly, misrepresenting our interests. And one of the challenges we're facing is the consistent misrepresentation of what Amharas want. An example, for instance, Getachew mentioned, Amharas want to bring unity or like pre-1950 Ethiopia. That is just, it has no resonance to whatsoever the Amharas are fighting now in Ethiopia. We're fighting for our survival. We don't have the luxury of caring about the country. That does not mean we're not in favor of continuity of Ethiopia, but that's a kind of conversation we would like to engage once we ensure our survival as a people. Right now, we are in an existential danger, and that is why we're fighting to ensure we survive as a people. And this lack of representation of Amharas, be it in 1991, be it in 2018 and all that, is creating problems in terms of understanding what the Amharas are saying. For instance, Professor Asgal confused or suggested that the Amhara PP officials could be speaking on behalf of Amharas. The Amhara people are fighting APP right now. They are waging war against the same people you mentioned. We would be on the front line to support any initiative to hold them accountable for whatever they said, for whatever they've done in the past years when they were in power. The APP, the Amhara people, Prosperity People Party officials are just puppets for Abiy regime. They are implicated in crime because they have to do certain things. They have to say certain things to make sure their salary continues. They have no moral or political base to say whatever they say. And they are outcasted essentially out of Amhara region. In an event of like Fano, toppling the Abiy government, these people will be seeking refuge elsewhere because they are so outcasted by the Amhara people to the extent that their livelihood is dependent on ensuring the continuing prosecution of Amharas. So they have any sort of legitimacy to speak on Amhara people, and they should be held accountable for any hostile rhetoric they used. And we will be supportive of that effort. In terms of dialogue, I think, and the identity question is, Amharas have been pleading directly to TPLF for decades to have proper conversation about the questions in Raya and Walqait. And the response have been consistent from TPLF side. No, we're not going to listen. We're not going to even recognize the question. We're going to prosecute it. We're going to eliminate you. And that's what happened. People talk about what happened in Walqait recently, but what has happened over the last 3 decades in that area? How many families have been buried? And what happened in Maikadra? And that's the main reason why Amharas fought and joined the war. Because what TPLF has shown in committing the Maikadra massacre against Amharas is if it was not for the intervention of the Amharas and others, Amharas within Walqait and Raya were in a severe danger for their life. And what happened in Raya after TPLF controlled recently that area, the fact that tens of thousands of Amharas were displaced again for the fifth time in just a few years, but also in terms of the number of killings, the number of arrests TPLF have committed, have shown that TPLF wants only the land there, and they don't recognize the people as people. They don't see as human, deserving of protection. And this has been a constant theme in the past 3 decades. Let's not.
But how can we resolve that as well as we look ahead into the future? Because we cannot reminisce on what has been happening for the last 30 years or probably even 300 years, depending on where we start history. So yeah, as much as I appreciate your response, but if you can also give us how to resolve all those sticking issues in your concluding remark.
Yeah, I think I'm mentioning this example is to say that one of the constant failures of the Ethiopian political class was misrepresenting the Amhara's interest and what their struggle, their wish has been, particularly since TPLF came to power. And that is what people are talking, the language they use, the framing they use when it comes to Walqait and Raya is an example of that broader problem. So to move away from that problem, I think we need to ensure that whatever negotiation, whatever dialogue happens, it involves the right, legitimately acceptable people to the people that we want to be part of the table. In the Pretoria Agreement, there was an argument that some Amhara officials in the federal government would represent Amharas. While I'm saying they have never been representative of Amharas, they've lost their legitimacy a long time ago. People like those who never should be even considered to speak on behalf of Amharas. The same should be said for other ethnic groups, I think. So we need a genuine transitional process. And this involves a couple of points. One, we have to get to the bottom of why Ethiopia is in the continuous cycle of violence. Instead of treating the symptoms, we have to address the structural sources of the violence. And this has been missed in the Pretoria Agreement and in the discourses before or after. Second, we need to center accountability in whatever transitional justice system we try to impose. Right now, what the Pretoria Agreement gave is impunity for perpetrators of different groups. And no one is pushing for accountability, starting from the lack of representation of civil society actors who should have been represented there in support of accountability first. No one is pushing for that. We need non-political actors, civil society actors, to be involved in any transitional justice system. And third, we cannot expect the same people who are putting the country in a perpetual cycle of violence to be the ones who solve the problem. We need to establish a transitional government that, with a clear mandate, ideally with civil society actors playing a prominent role. And this transitional government, on the one hand, has to pursue a mandate to ensure accountability for all the crimes that have been committed in different parts of Ethiopia, including the Amhara genocide that has been going on for 4 decades. On the other hand, coming up with a genuine consultation process to answer a question by all Ethiopians: what kind of Ethiopia we want, what kind of relationship we want. We need new social contract that is accepted by majority of Ethiopians, if not all. That's ambitious. And what we have seen in 2018 or in 2020, or even before in 1991, was lack of genuine transitional process. It was a victorious justice mechanism that we followed. And we have to move away from that. We really need to reflect to the bottom underlying issues that are getting us into this cycle of violence. And for that, I think we need to avoid the temptation to carry these foreign fictions, including by scholars of supposedly Ethiopian scholars, Ethiopian studies scholars, who paint one group in a negative way, particularly Amharas, partly for their own job, to make money, to make livelihood, but partly because they're just not dissent or humble enough to listen to Ethiopians. We have to take charge of these conversations as Ethiopians. We cannot be, always asking foreigners to demand, a solution. We have to do the hard job of sitting down, genuinely listening to each other, and avoiding the temptation to misrepresent the wishes of people, drawing from, literature or some fictional arguments in journals and books. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hona. So now I shall give Professor Hiskel to provide his concluding remarks, and particularly what do we need to do and what shall be done in order to ensure peace in Ethiopia. So Professor, the floor is yours to make your concluding remark and the message for the day.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for civil discussion. What I would say is that because we were assembled here today to discuss the progress that was made and the effectiveness of the Pretoria Agreement between the federal government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. So this does not mean that issues pertaining to peace, stability, growth, and prosperity in Ethiopia were discussed here. So we were specifically discussing the Pretoria Agreement, not other issues. Other grievances, we could talk about it to the end of days. But what could we learn from this, and how could this agreement be used as a model for other places to settle political conflicts is, I think, the focus of the discussion. But we're discussing this in the context of prevailing realities in Ethiopia. The country faces big problems that have implications for the next generation. Because of this incessant war in Ethiopia, something that I personally thought that we had left behind, at least in 1991, we've been back at it for the last 6 years. I don't know if this is really our culture. If this war is really our choice. Conflict is our choice, both in words and in action. I've heard some people saying that this is a curse on Ethiopia. That this is a curse. I believe that we can change the course, but I think we have a problem of leadership. The big problems are, as I was saying earlier, is about the education of the next generation of our children, not country's children. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, which is a government entity, has issued a report this year about schools. I have mentioned that at least that report states that more than 4,000 schools are not operational in Amhara region. More than 640 are not in operation in Tigray. About 195 in the Somali region. About 50 in Benishangul Gumuz. About 40 in Gambela. And Afar 26, and Southwest Ethiopia, the new Southwest region, about 8. The total is about 5,568 schools are not operating. This is the report from the Human Rights Commission. It is about deprivation of human rights that Mr. Yared was concerned about at the beginning about human rights. In terms of health, you get it from that report again. In terms of health, because of war, because of conflict, and because of government not paying salaries to workers in the health sector, and because of related issues, clinics, hospitals, pharmacies were robbed, were plundered, and destroyed, and are rendered dysfunctional. They're not functioning. They're not providing services in the regions where they were destroyed. This has an adverse impact on the health of our fellow citizens. Just an example, because I don't want to go on the numbers. just as an example, because of this raging war in the Amhara region, about 1.4 million people were affected by cholera, by malaria, and 400 were killed by malaria. Malaria is killing people in Ethiopia. Even when I was young, we had a malaria eradication service. We've been at it. I thought we had succeeded from malaria eradication to preventing from Obama to Obama Kalakaya. Now 400 people in the Amhara region, and in other regions there are no waradas in Ethiopia's regions that are not affected by malaria, cholera, and other epidemics, some of which I can't translate into Amharic from the report. What all this is telling us is that conflict in that country is exacting a heavy price, not only on this generation, I wouldn't go into that, but also in the next generation. It is compromising the ability of the next generation to meet its own needs, which indicates to me that we're going to be in perpetual war because, as Getachew said, Garth had fallen silent, probably true. But I read that through the text and he has some qualifications. Maybe he was listening to what we were talking about here. Yes, guns have fallen silent. We celebrate that. But as long as deprivations, abject poverty, and conflict exist, continue, that other depredations continue, you cannot ensure lasting peace. It's impossible. So let me say, echoing what Mr. Yared was saying, that yes, the agreement with all its weaknesses and deficiencies, the approach to political differences, to resolving political differences through negotiations in and of itself, much less the articles that I outlined we outlined here. The fact that the approach to resolve political differences through negotiations should be taken, should be welcomed and then supported. What that means is continue to support the Pretoria Agreement, continue to support and implement faithfully the Pretoria Agreement as much as possible. Return to the status quo ante, as was said in the agreement. If the two sides or all sides in Ethiopia, as was declared in the Pretoria Constitution, are resolved to seek lasting and comprehensive solution to conflict in Tigray and everywhere else, that's what it says in the text itself. If the parties are convinced, as they say, to resolving through seeking peaceful settlement to political differences that are in dispute, are determined, this is what they say, are determined to seek peaceful and lasting solutions in Tigray, continue to honor your own words. And if it's working in Tigray, apply it elsewhere, in Amhara and in Oromia. They were almost on the verge of an agreement before the Dar es Salaam peace talks or resolution of cessation of conflict in Dar es Salaam, which I know full well what happened, was not torpedoed by one of the parties. It was torpedoed after almost 90% of the terms were in agreement. What was left was procedural and implementation issues. Just as Pretoria was signed and the implementation modalities were agreed to in the Nairobi Declaration, that's where they were. Just because they did not agree in about 5 to 10% doesn't mean they cannot sign an agreement on the 90% they agree. But it was torpedoed. So if, as they say in the case of Tigray, and if they recognize how destructive war is and that how it's not the right approach to resolving political problems, if they mean what they say, especially the federal government of Ethiopia, take this as a success, as a work in process, but then apply it to everywhere else. Because we have other things to do on poverty, on the economy. Just yesterday, I heard 400 factories or industrial sites were closed in Ethiopia. That means a lot of jobs were sacrificed. A few months ago, 700, according to the Minister of Industry, 700 installations were closed. It's not the right way. This is not the right direction. So let's start with peacemaking. It all begins with the idea that political differences exist in Ethiopia, but they cannot be resolved militarily and through violence. Let's go return to the status quo ante and then come to the table, sit at the table and sort out our differences and continue to sort out our differences periodically, because it's not going to be resolved in one shot, one agreement. It takes a while and a lot of work. That's my final statement here.
Professor, thank you so much. I think we all can relate to what you have provided. Looking ahead, I think, as I put in the title, that the guns are silent somewhere, somehow, but there is no peace anywhere in Ethiopia. So if they are really determined, as they claim to be, so this is a time, actually it's already late to learn from a past recent mistake and try to, at least in hostilities in other parts of Ethiopia, as well as honoring the terms and conditions of the Pretoria Agreement. And we can see that the dogs of war are not leashed yet, they are still out. I can't explain it better than you, Professor, in terms of the cost of war. So that's what I would like to say. Unless there is any pressing issues that you would like to say, I think that will bring us to the end of our today's panel. And if there are other issues that we would like to discuss about, for example, in relation to people, relationship, reconciliation, and political dialogue between, for example, Amhara and Tigray and other issues, we might arrange another panel to discuss about those issues. So in the interest of time, I would like to call the day. Thank you so much for joining us today. Professor Iskel Gapisa, Mr. Getachew Tamare, Mr. Honeman Defro, and Mr. Yared Ailamaram, and of course, our friend, Mr. Faisal Roble. Thanks so much. All right.
Thank you, Morgus.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Thank you so much, and good night and goodbye.
የሐሳብ ገበታ ሐሳብ ያለ ልዩነት ሚዛናዊነት እንዲሁም በአሳታፊነት የሚንሸራሸርበት ቤት። በሐሳብ ገበታችን ወቅታዊ፣ ማህበራዊ፣ ፖለቲካዊ እንዲሁም የህግ ጉዳዮች በስፋት በጥልቀትና በአካታችነት ይቀርባሉ። የሳምንቱ እንግዳ የሳምንቱ በተጋባዥ የማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች፣ ፖለቲከኞች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች የሚቀርቡበት ፕሮግራም ወቅታዊ ጉዳይ፣ ወቅታዊ ሀገራዊ ጉዳዮች የሚዳሰሱበት ዝግጅት፣ የውይይትና የክርክር መድረክ፣ በተለያየ ጎራ የሚገኙ ታላላቅ ፖለቲከኞች፣ የማህበረሰብ አንቂዎች እንዲሁም ሙያተኞች በሐሳብ ዙሪያ ፊት ለፊት የሚወያዩበት ከዛም አልፎ የሚሟገቱበት ፕሮግራም፣ ህዝባዊ መድረክ፣ በተለያዩ ጉዳዮች ላይ ሁሉም የሐሳብ ገበታ ቤተሰቦች በቀጥታ ሐሳባቸውን የሚያቀርቡበትና ተሳታፊ የሚሆኑበት ለቤተሰቦቻችን እድል የምንሰጥበት ጊዜም። እነዚህና ሌሎች ሳምንታዊ ፕሮግራሞችን ለእናንተ እናቀርባለን። ይህንን የተወደደ ቻናል ሰብስክራይብ በማድረግ ቤተሰብ ይሁኑ፣ በስፋት ተደራሽ እንዲሁም ለሌሎች ያጋሩም። የሐሳብ ገበታው እንዲጠናከር በተሻለ ጥራትና ስፋት ወደ እናንተ እንዲደርስ በሐሳቦ በሙያውና በገንዘቦ ይደግፉን። የሐሳብ ገበታን በሱፐር ቻት፣ በሱፐር ታንክስና በሱፐር ስቲከር አጋርነቱን ያሳዩን። በጎፈንድሚ አማራጭ የሐሳብ ገበታን ያበረታቱ። ስለ ሐሳብ አስተያየቶ እንዲሁም ድጋፎም እናመሰግናለን። ዓላማችን የሐሳብ ማህበረሰብ መፍጠር